Second Great Bank Depression. Why that name? Because this period of economic chaos, loss, and global financial destruction was manufactured by the men who shaped the banking sector. They had help, of course, but this debacle is as man-made and as avoidable as the Great Depression was. If anyone in the Oval Office, in Congress, at the Federal Reserve, in the Treasury Department, or in the offices of any regulatory agency had done any serious preventative work, had exposed the murky Wall Street practices before they blew up in our collective faces, had contained reckless trading and borrowing activities, or rendered financial firms smaller and more transparent, if any of these people had cared, the crash could have been avoided, or at least would have been far less severe. Millions of jobs and trillions of dollars would have been spared. Billions of dollars of bonuses wouldn't have rewarded the mostly legal but ridiculously risky practices that had such devastating effects. The deluge of money pouring from all orifices of Washington into the banks gives tacit approval to the culture of banking, a world based on crazy compensation, counterproductive competition, and loosely regulated practices and laws. Yet it was all pushed by a select group of Wall Street power players who moved back and forth with all too much ease between our nation's capital and the gilded realm of finance. If it seems as if the culture of Goldman Sachs pervades the halls of Washington, that's because the people of Goldman Sachs pervade the halls of Washington. That's why, despite all the talk in Washington now about reforming the system, the same execs who orchestrated its failures were the ones hobnobbing with the political leaders of both parties, both the Bush and the Obama administrations. In fact, Obama is even closer to some of the financial execs than Bush was. In the early spring of 2009, he called a meeting with Wall Street's heads to ask them to accept responsibility for causing the crisis and to commit to helping to mitigate it, as if that admission would change the rules of the game. And that's kind of one of the takeaways from a lot of this period. We have seen in the past year what began as the collapse of Lehman Brothers, one of the major investment banks, which has now become the biggest bankruptcy in the country, usurping WorldCom at the time of those periods of scandals. AIG we have seen bailed out. We have seen the banks become bigger than they were before the crisis. And why? Because they were allowed to by the Federal Reserve, whose job it is to monitor the banking system. So when it is your job to basically deter, supposedly risk, from cascading out of finance and out of Wall Street and basically descending upon the rest of the country and the rest of the economy, and you don't do that job, that is just a complete moral, ethical, and just incompetence, a lack of moral and ethical fortitude, and a complete incompetence on the part of a very, very strong regulatory entity on Wall Street. Last year, on September 21st, Sunday night, it was dark, it was late, everyone was sleeping except a bunch of bankers at Goldman Sachs and Morgan Stanley and a bunch of members from the Fed, Treasury Secretary, former CEO of Goldman Sachs, Hank Paulson, got together to decide effectively how to save two banks. That was two banks that day. Lehman had just failed. Merrill Lynch was about to fail. Goldman Sachs and Morgan Stanley did not want to be taken over by anyone else, didn't want to fail, which is, none of us want to fail, but basically came and allowed themselves and asked for the right to become something called bank holding companies. And I talk about this in a book, and it's a kind of a distinction that we don't really think of. But back in the day, after the Great Depression, there was a number of laws that were enacted. There was a crash in 29, which we know about. There was a Great Depression that followed that. And during that time, what FDR did when he came in to be the president, and with a Republican Treasury Secretary, Secretary Wooden, and a bipartisan Congress, pushed a rule called, an act called the Glass-Steagall Act, which separated the banking sector. Why? Because it behaved badly. It's like, when you have two kids in the playground and they're butting at each other, and one's a bully and and they're creating chaos and they're hurting other kids or whatever it might be, you break them up. And one of the things that happened was Congress decided with this act, Glass-Steagall Act, to break up the banks, to basically render them less destructive to everybody else. And they did that by saying, first of all, they went in and they actually looked at the books of these banks. And this is very different from what has happened during this period. In this period, Treasury Secretary Tim Geithner has put stress tests on the banks to see how healthy or not they still are, and allow the banks to fill in their own blanks. So so of course the more powerful ones look more healthy. There's no shock there. They actually are filling in their own answers, and they created the tests. But in 1933, that wasn't the case. We had a bank holiday that basically FDR closed the banks, legally closed the banks, and went in, not him personally, but basically had people go in and actually look at what was going on. We'd had this major catastrophe in finance. The country was hemorrhaging economically. And he said, all right, well, let us look at what they're doing. And that wasn't a pretty sight. And then separate from that, basically divided them up. Said there will be commercial banks and there will be investment banks. Commercial banks are banks that deal with checking accounts, savings accounts, give simple mortgages, simple auto loans, that basically act with regular people. Investment banks, by definition, are there to create, well, capital out of nothing, but also to take risks, to speculate, and to grow in that manner. They're not related at all. One is dealing more specifically with the general consumer, and one is dealing more specifically with just trying to speculate and make money, which was the cause of the crash in 1929 and the Great Depression. So there was a solution. Keep them apart, create an FDIC, which is an agency that will back the deposits of consumers so that we are protected. Have the government protect consumers, protect the citizens, and know what the risk of that was, because they could understand what commercial banks do. It was clear. They deal with people. They do simple things. We get it. And we're comfortable backing something we get. Investment banks were on their own. If they were going to fail, they were going to fail. And banks failed. Investment banks and different kinds of funds that were being speculated failed over the years. So did other banks. But the fact is that the government didn't come in and bail them out. Even when we had long-term capital management, which was one of these big catastrophe hedge funds almost going under a number of years ago, we didn't bail them out. The government didn't bail them out. There was a meeting amongst a bunch of bank leaders who were involved in this particular hedge fund, and they bailed their comrade out. We didn't. And what has happened now is we have had a destruction of those separations between commercial banks and investment banks. We've had a repeal of the Glass-Steagall, a bipartisan repeal of that act in 1999. It was a 92-8 vote in the Senate. It was not debated that much. There were some senators that were against it that even said, and I have a quote in the book from this, Senator Byron Dorgan actually said, this will cost us billions of dollars. This will cost us taxpayers billions of dollars if we do this, if we allow things we don't understand to merge together and assume their risk, and assume the fact that if they fail, if some of them fail, we, i.e. the government, we, the public, have to pay to bail them out. And a couple of other wise people at the time said that. Paul Volcker, who has recently, former Fed chairman, come out and said that we should reinstate a Glass-Steagall, that right now we are creating a situation where these too big to fail banks, and I would also say too complex to exist banks, too complex to regulate banks, are in danger of causing an even worse crisis than they have already caused. The difference is that this time when they cause a crisis, they're doing it on the back of our money. It's like when you go to Vegas and you lose. And then you turn around to your friend and say, can you lend me money to bet, because I'm sure this time I'm going to bet on the right number, get the right color, whatever, hit blackjack. And then you do it again and again and again and again. And at the end of the day, you lose. And you've lost not only the $100 you put down on the first table, but you have lost all the money that you have borrowed along the way that you just don't have to pay back. And that was really what the banking system did to get us involved in this. They borrowed against loans. They borrowed against subprime. They packaged them. They went and borrowed against them. They went and traded against them. And they created this whole upside-down pyramid of extra stuff. A former colleague of mine at Goldman Sachs, who was a partner there, said to me that finance is one of the only disciplines based on the creation of absolutely nothing. And it's true. You're basically, finance is about moving nothing for something while you can get someone else to pay for it. And at some point, the gig's up. There's no there. And that was what happened. Subprime was blamed, and individuals at the bottom of this pyramid were initially blamed by the media and by many in Washington, and still by many people in this country, for causing this crisis. It was a housing crisis. Treasury Secretary Hank Paulson at the time called it a housing correction. It was just a little correction. And it wasn't. It was the bottom of a pyramid of a whole lot of practices and a whole lot of risk and a whole lot of assets that were created